Yoma, Dafim Yudtes through Chafei. Back on Daf Yudches, the Mishnah had said that the Ziknei Beis Din, the elders of Beis Din, would make the Kohen Gadol take a shvua that he would do the avodah properly. It says, Mashpiyin anu alecha, shlo teshana davar mikol ma shamarnu lecha, you will not deviate from what we have instructed you to do. The Mishnah had said, Hu parish uboche, v'hein parish uboche. He would cry, they would cry. So the Gemara in Yudtes explains, what was the issue? Why were they crying? So he cried because he was suspected of being a Tzeduki. The reason they had to make him swear is because they suspected he would do the avodah in the Tzeduki way. They cried because also they suspected him of being a Tzeduki, and if he was innocent, they were Choshed B'Ksheira. What was the Tzeduki issue? What do they suspect him of doing? So the Gemara explains that the Tzedukim believed that the Ketores had to be set on fire before the Kohen Gadol entered the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Our Masorah says we only do it inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Tzedukim would try to infiltrate the position of Kohen Gadol to do the avodah their way. We would make him swear that he would do it the correct way, and if he were indeed innocent, he would be offended, he would be hurt, and he would cry, and the Ziknei Beis Din would cry because they may have suspected an innocent person. So we see an interesting thing. They weren't wrong in suspecting him. It seems they had to suspect him. There was the very real possibility of Tzeduki infiltration. Nevertheless, insofar as he was innocent, they hurt the feelings of an innocent person, and that's something they had to feel bad about. So we see that you can do the right thing, but even if you do the right thing, if you hurt somebody else, it's still something you need to cry about. It's still something that's a real problem. We find a similar idea in Tosus in Maseches Tanis. The Gemara says, Shmuel says, someone who is Yoshev B'Tanis, someone who voluntarily accepts upon himself to fast when he's not mechuyev to, is called a chote. This type of asceticism, depriving yourself of innocent pleasure, is wrong, and you're called a chote. Tosfos asks a contradiction. Elsewhere, Shmuel seems to say that Yoshev B'Tanis is a legitimate thing to do. It's appropriate, it's permissible to fast. So Tosfos says that it's both. At the same time, it's both a mitzvah and an avera. The mitzvah outweighs the avera. The mitzvah that it helps your personal development in certain cases can actually outweigh the avera. So on balance, it's the right thing to do. But that doesn't negate the aspect of chait involved. There is an aspect of chait, and therefore you're still called the chote, even though it's the right thing to do. A very odd idea, but that's what Tosfos says. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz seems to say something similar. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz is talking about, there's a famous midrash of Chazal that Pnina and Chana were both married to Elkanah. Chana was childless. Pnina used to torment Chana, and Pnina was eventually punished severely by her children dying. Why did Pnina torment Chana this way? So Chazal say she did it because she wanted to goad her into praying so she would eventually have a child. L'shem Shemayim Neskavna. She meant well. She was doing it to help Chana. And eventually it worked. Chana did pray. Chana's prayers were answered and she had a child. She had Shmuel. So why was Pnina punished? If she was L'shem Shemayim Neskavna, why was she punished by the terrible punishment of her children dying? So Rav Chaim Shmulevitz explains, even though Pnina was a tzedekes gemura, she was absolutely righteous, must have been very difficult for her to hurt an innocent woman like Chana. It was very hard for her to do it. She did it out of pure principle, out of compassion. She meant well. Nevertheless, he says, she was punished by this terrible punishment. How does that work? He says, someone who hurts somebody else, you can have the purest and best intentions in the world. It doesn't matter. The consequences of hurting somebody else, Benadon l'chavero, is like the consequence of a fire burning. Intention, and you meant well, none of it matters. You hurt another Jew, even for legitimate reasons, you are going to be punished, and that sounds very similar to what happened to what the Beis Din was worried about over there. Beis Din hurt the feelings, possibly, of an innocent Kohen Gadol, even though they had to suspect him of it because there was a very real chance that he was doing this, but nevertheless, on the chance that they hurt an innocent person's feelings, they cried, because that's something that a person has to feel bad about. Rav Victor Nevensel, a Talmud of Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, has a hard time understanding this idea. He says Rav Chaim Shmulevitz can't really mean this. He says, if it's the right thing, why are you punished? So he suggests that subconsciously she may have had an impure motive. But Kipshuta, Rav Chaim Shmulevitz is saying that it's like fire, he says. It's not a question of right and wrong. Fire burns. If you hurt another Jew's feelings, you get punished, even if it's the right thing to do, even if you did what you had to do. They tell a similar story about Rabbi Yoel Lapian, that when he left Europe, he stayed in Europe. When his father went to America, he stayed behind in Europe to study Torah, and he was very worried he hurt his father's feelings. So years later, he visited his father's grave to ask Mechila. He explained he had no doubt that he did the right thing in staying behind in Europe so he could grow he could grow as a Jew. But nevertheless, he still hurt his father's feelings, he says. And when you hurt somebody else's feelings, even if you're justified, you still have to ask Mechila. On Daf Chaf, it says that the Kohen Gadol would stay up at night, the night before Yom Kippur Day, and it says that people would stay up. It says that other people would stay up also, but there was a problem with that because people used to end up sinning. That people in the Gvulin outside the Mikdash would do that Zeichel Mikdash, but they ended up sinning. The men and the women would be together, they'd be staying up, they'd be idle, and they would end up sinning in an immoral way. The Gemara goes on. The Gemara says that Eliyahu once told someone, "You know why Mashiach hasn't come? Because it's Yom Kippur, and yet there was terribly licentious behavior going on with women. That's why Mashiach is not coming." So it's an amazing thing. Yom Kippur, we would think that Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, is the one day where we don't have to worry so much about these types of averos, of immorality. But nevertheless, even on Yom Kippur, these things can occur, and we have to make an effort to avoid them. The Gemara in Megillah says that Yom Kippur, Mincha, we read Achremos. We read about the Ereva. We read the part in the morning. Of course, we read the beginning of Achremos, which is the Avoda of Yom Kippurim in the temple. But in Mincha, we read the Parsha of Arayos and Achremos, and the Haftarah is Yonah. Why do we read the Parsha of Arayos for Mincha? Rishonim give various explanations. Tosfos says because the women are all dressed up, they're perfumed in honor of Yom Kippur. And they were tempting. There was a concern that there would be a problem of sin, of erva involved, and therefore we read the Parsha of Arayos to warn you, stay away from erva. Again, Chazal were hard-headed. It's the holiest day of the year, but human nature is still human nature, and there's a danger of erva even on Yom Kippur. The Gemara goes on. The Gemara says if the Satan has reshus to cause trouble, to mekatreg, to accuse, the 364 days of the year, the Satan is bigamatria. The Ha-Satan is Bigamatria 364. A solar day is 365. The Satan has permission to do his malevolent trade 364 days of the year, not Yom Kippur. What does that mean? The Meiri has a characteristically rationalist explanation that Aseret Tshuva, Yom Kippur in particular, are days that are designated for Tshuva. Tshuva is good all year round, but especially on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a day where that's designated for Tshuva. That's what Chazal meant when they said the Satan is not Mekatrig on Yom Kippur. They mean that Yom Kippur is a day which is calibrated, which is designed for Tshuva, and hopefully through Tshuva he seems to mean the Satan will not be Mekatrig. On Daf Chaf Aleph, the Gemara is discussing various nisim, various miracles that happened in the temple. So it says a couple of nisim the Gemara says, not on the initial list, but a couple of nisim the Gemara adds are Makom Aron Einam and Hamida. The dimensions of the Aron itself were not part of the dimensions of the Kodesh HaKodashim. Similarly, the Kruvim B'nei Hayomd, that the Aron and the Kruvim, that there was some kind of that the geometry of the Kodesh HaKodashim didn't add up. Makom Aron, it says in Malachim that the Kodesh HaKodashim of the Beis HaMikdash that Shlomo made was 20 amos by 20 amos. And it also says we know that there were 10 amos on each side of the Aron. So if there were 10 amos on one side of the Aron, 10 amos on the other side of the Aron, and the Aron had some finite dimension, that's more than 20. It simply doesn't add up. So either the arithmetic is it doesn't add up, or the geometry isn't following the normal laws of geometry. Anes, Makom Aron Einam and Amida. Similarly for the Kruvim, B'nei Hayomdin, because the wingspan of the Kruvim were 20 amos, and again, the dimensions of the Kodesh HaKodashim were 20 amos. What happened to the body of the Kruvim? Again, the geometry or the arithmetic doesn't add up. It doesn't follow the normal rules of mathematics. This Gemara seems to be saying that even not just the laws of nature are sometimes violated by nisim, but even the basic laws of geometry, of mathematics, of space-time, of space, even those can be violated by nisim. This is actually a somewhat controversial point. There is a doctrine in the Rishonim, the philosophical Rishonim particularly, of Teva Hanimna Hakayim, that nisim can apply to the physical laws of nature. God made nature, God made the universe, God can override the laws of nature, but fundamental laws of logic and theology, we don't say that God can do. The famous riddle about can God make a stone too heavy for him to lift, the Rishonim don't discuss that, but the Rishonim do say that there are certain fundamental theological impossibilities. Can God make They say we don't say God can make a being like himself, can split himself into two. We don't say that. We don't say he can violate fundamental laws of logic. Rambam says this at length. And the Rashba also. The Rashba in Tshuva seems to accept this doctrine. He says, Rashba was asked, how is Matan Torah possible? If someone asked him, a philosopher, a Jewish philosophically minded person asked him, if the Jews weren't on the Madrega to receive the Torah, if they weren't on the Madrega to have Nevuah, how could Hashem override that? It's impossible. The Rashba said, no, it's not impossible. It's a nace. He said, Hashem can do whatever he wants. But in the course of that explanation, the Rashba explains that there are two types of impossibilities. There are fundamental logical impossibilities that are inconceivable, he says, like logical impossibilities, fundamental theological impossibilities, and those we don't say Hashem can do. And then there are violations of the laws of nature, like violating gravity or violating the laws of nature. So that, he says, of course Hashem can do. Hashem can override the laws of nature. Giving prophecy, giving the Torah to people who aren't sufficiently sophisticated, on a sufficiently high madrega, that's a nace, but Hashem could do that, so you shouldn't be asking questions on how Hashem could do that, since we believe Hashem can make nisim. But in the course of this explanation, the Rashba says that fundamental logical and theological impossibilities are so immutably impossible, he says, we don't even say that Hashem can do them. One of the examples he gives is that this is for the side of a quadrilateral to be equal its diagonal. We know that the diagonal of a quadrilateral is always longer than the sides, and other logical impossibilities. So the Rashba seems to say that even certain fundamental geometric impossibilities would be included in the absolutely impossible, that we don't even say Hashem can violate via nes. This Gemara, Kipshuto, seems to say otherwise. This Gemara seems to say that fundamental arithmetic equations, simple geometric inequalities, can be violated by an ace, and were violated. This point is made by Rav Moshe Teitelbaum, the author of the Yismach Moshe. He says that he rejects this whole notion, which he attributes to philosophers, doesn't acknowledge that it's the Rambam, but he rejects this whole notion that there's anything that Hashem can't do, no matter how impossible it is, Hashem can always do it, he says. And he brings this Gemara as a proof. He says, the Gemara says, even basic nothing is impossible for Hashem. Again, he's disagreeing with Rishon, but this is what he says. On Daf Chaf Beis, next parak, the Mishnah says that that they did a kind of lottery to decide who would do certain avodas. So it said that everyone would stick out a finger, and then they would count the fingers. So the Gemara says, why couldn't they just count people directly? Why bother with counting fingers? So the Gemara says, you're not allowed to count people. Asher limna, says Yisrael, if you lose our mitzvah, you're not allowed to count people at all. Brings the pasuk in Shmuel that when they wanted to count the Jewish people, it says vayifkedeim bevazek, and the Gemara understands that it was some kind of token they gave. They counted the tokens rather than the people. So it says maybe not. Maybe bazek means a place. Elsewhere in Tanakh, bazek means a place. So it says another pasuk in Shmuel. It says vayishama shol asa'am vayifkedeim betlaim. They counted them via sheep. The sheep were proxies for the people, so they counted the sheep. They didn't count the people. The Gemara goes on, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Kol Hamones Yisrael over Belav. Anyone who counts the Jewish people violates a negative commandment. Brings the pasuk in Hosea. V'haya mitzvah b'nei Yisrael k'chol hayam asher lo yimad v'lo yisafer. Two lavim. Another shita says lo yimad v'lo yisafer. Two lavim. You're not allowed to count the Jewish people. The Ramban says that this applies even if you count via a proxy. Apparently, you can still only count for a good reason. And there's a story again in Sefer Shmuel where Hashem was angry at David for counting the people. Even though presumably he did count via proxies, the Ramban says he wouldn't have missed such a basic halacha. Nevertheless, if there wasn't a good reason, that he just did it to be proud of being a king on a large people, that's not legitimate. You have to have a good reason just to be excited about being the king of a large nation. That's not a good reason. That's why he was punished. Contemporary poskim discuss, is there a heter for the census? In Israel, they conduct a census. You're not allowed to count Jews. Even indirectly, the Ramban says you have to have a good reason. So poskim struggle with this. Some poskim said it was okay. Some poskim give various justifications for this. Some poskim say that maybe it's considered indirect counting. Still, it has to be considered a tzarech, like the Ramban says. Poskim give a variety of heterim or Bavad Yosef or Vasher Weiss. Some poskim say that it's only usher if you count verbally, but if you count in writing, that's not as bad. Some poskim say it's only if you count the entire nation. If you count a portion of the nation, that's not a problem. Rav Asher Weiss points out, we rely on this all the time. Forget national census, as he says. A school counts how many students they have. We count how many people there are in a minyan, he says. We count all the time. So obviously we rely on some form of these heterim. So he says, so it's obvious. So the census also, he says, many poskim said the census was okay, although there were some who said not. There were some more hardline poskim who said no, a Jew should not participate in the census. Rav Asher Weiss points out, mentions the common custom to count. When you count for a minyan, you count. Some poskim say you can count mentally in your head. You shouldn't count out. You shouldn't count out loud, or you shouldn't. Or you shouldn't count out loud. Or you can count just by internally or by looking at people, but not verbally. You shouldn't point. Some poskim say there's a common minhag. He said people count by the words of the pasuk Shiyas Amecha. He's not sure what the source is. He brings a Rashi who brings a different pasuk, Vani barov chastecha v'ovesecha. But he's not really sure what this idea of counting via the pasuk is. He suggests maybe people don't know when you reach 7 words, you're not sure it's 7, so that's not called counting because it's only when you finish the pasuk. Anyway, that's the minhag. He says the minhag is we do count for various things. We have to rely on some of these heterim for counting, whether it's a minyan, whether it's for administrative purposes like a school, and even the national census. He says can be justified based on these various heterim. On Daf Chav Gimel, so we have a Gemara. The Gemara starts on Chav Beis. The Gemara says that a Talmid Chacham has to bear grudges. Kol Talmid Chacham she'eino nokim v'noter k'nachash. A Talmid Chacham can't just turn the other cheek. A Talmid Chacham has to, when he is insulted, he has to not take it lightly. He has to take it seriously and bear a grudge and take revenge. He has to be nokim v'noter k'nachash. The Gemara says, really? It says lo sikom v'lo sitar. We just had in the parsha. You're not allowed to take revenge. You're not allowed to bear grudges. You're not allowed to take revenge. So the Gemara says that's only b'mammon. When someone does something financially to you, he doesn't lend you something that you need, so that's something that you shouldn't bear a grudge and you shouldn't take revenge for. But if he insults you, he hurts you personally, that's something that you are allowed to bear a grudge for. Then the Gemara brings, really? But even Sarah de Gufa, even insults, there is an ideal conduct of Hanelavim, Beinam Olvim, people who are insulted and don't answer back and just accept their insults and don't return an insult. Hashem is, these are considered people who love Hashem, will be rewarded. Ohavav, Kitzeis Hashem Ashpik V'raso, that's considered an ideal. So the Gemara says, well, Nakit Le Belibe, but maybe you don't answer back, but you still have it inside your heart. Then the Gemara says, no, but Rava says, Kol Mavral Midosef. It's good to be Mavral Midosef, to not take revenge on people. The Gemara says, Matthias Le Matthias. The conclusion of the Gemara is not exactly clear. The Gemara seems to be saying in the beginning that Tzara de Gufa, there's no losikim and lositer. When someone insults you, when someone hurts you beyond financial injury, hurts you personally by an insult or something like that, then there's no issue of losikim and lositer. However, some Rishonim don't bring this distinction. The Rambam, the Sefer HaChinuch, they do not bring this distinction. The other Rishonim do, the Smag does, but the Rambam and the Chinuch do not bring this distinction. They seem to imply that losikim and lositer always applies. So the Achronim struggle with how they understood this Gemara. They propose other readings of the Gemara. The Chafetz Chaim, in the introduction to his Sefer on Lashon Hara, the Chafetz Chaim says that it's not entirely clear, lahalacha, whether losikim and lositar does or does not apply to Tzara de Gufa. He proposes an alternate reading of the Gemara, that when the Gemara brings the pasuk of Hanelavim Beinam, the Bryce of Hanelavim Beinam Olvim, he says, then at that point, the Gemara is chozer, the Gemara says even Tzara de Gufa is Aser and is losikim and lositar, subject to losikim and lositar. It's only a Talmid Chacham for covered Torah who's allowed to be Nakit Le Belibe. Akal Param Ladina, the Chafetz Chaim concludes it's Machlokes Rishonim. Some Rishonim take this Gemara at face value and say there is no prohibition of losikim and lositar when it comes to Tzara de Gufa. Other Rishonim, like the Rambam, seem to paskin that losikim and lositar is universal, regardless of what he did to you. Lahalacha, the Chafetz Chaim says that it's Machlokes HaPoskim, he says, and you should be machmer certainly Safek Daraisa L'chumra. On Daf Chav Daled, the Gemara talks about how they would have multiple gorelos, they would have several payases. The Gemara says, why do you do multiple payases instead of one big one? Hargish Kol Azara, they wanted to make a lot of noise and a lot of commotion, based on the pasuk, Asher Yachtov Nam Tiksod, Beveis Elokim Nehalech Baragesh. So the second half of the pasuk, Beveis Elokim Nehalech Baragesh, the Rashi explains, Lahargish Azara, to make a noise or commotion, that's covered for the melech, to show that we're all busy with the avoda, we're interested, to make a hullabaloo, a commotion, is part of covered for the avoda and covered for Hashem. There are various other sources in Midrashim and Rishonim, Achronim, that bring a variety of other interpretations of this pasuk of Beis Elokim Nehalech Baragesh, that we learn other halachas or other minhagim about the way to conduct oneself in a shul. In Kala Rabasi, it says that Achitofel once found David walking to the Beis Medrash on his own, solitary. He told him, no, it says, V'veis Elokim Nehalach B'Ragesh, he says, B'Regishus B'nei Adam, Ne'elech Niva'ata. You're supposed to have a crowd of people, at least two. Two is a crowd in this context. You shouldn't go by yourself. You should go to, I guess to show that it's important to go to the Beis Midrash, you should go together with someone else. You shouldn't go by yourself. Rambam says, a person in a shul, a person has to have Yiras Shamayim, a person should mahalech be'emo v'yira, with fear, ra'ada, with trepidation. Shnemru b'veis Elokim Nehalach B'Ragesh, a person has to behave himself in God's house with ema v'yira v'ra'ada. Rav Lichtenstein says that this is the way a person has to conduct himself. Regesh is like the modern Hebrew word for we call regesh. It means with emotion. He should feel the holiness and the gravity of the place. He says, and he should conduct himself with yira. Rabbeinu Yona, in his work Sefer Yira, Rabbeinu Yona says you should run when you go to shul. When you approach near the shul, you should run. He brings this pasuk, B'veis Elokim Nehalach B'Ragesh, that he understands B'Ragesh means you should eagerly go fast. You should run to the shul. That's how he understands B'veis Elokim Nehalach B'Ragesh. Rav Shlomo Aviner was once asked, does a person have to go to shul with a minyan 10 minutes in the snow? There's snow and it's a 10-minute walk. Does he have to walk 10 minutes in the snow? Rav Aviner said yes, up to 20 minutes. I'm not sure if 20 minutes is a limit or he just meant twice as many as 10. Yes, a person should go to shul for a minyan even in the snow. And he says that people say, B'derech Remez, B'veis Elokim Nehalach B'Ragesh. What is Ragesh? Ragesh is an acronym, Reish, that Beis, Reish, Gimel, Shin. Beis is Barad, hail. Reish is Ruach, wind. Gimel is Geshem. Shin is Sheleg. Kind of like the Postal Service creed, neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night will stop them from delivering mail. So a person should go to shul, B'Ragesh. Barad, Ruach, Geshem, and Sheleg. On Daf Chafei, it says that these payasses, these lotteries would take place in the Lishkas HaGazos, in an office, in a room called Lishkas HaGazos. Tosfos, and it says when they made the payas, it says that when they counted around in the circle, they would have to know where the starting point was. They would take off the mitznefes from one of them, and they would know that's where the payas was starting from the person who wasn't wearing his hat, his turban. Tosfos asks that why didn't they do the Gemara later indicates that the payas should be in a makom kadosh, inside the azara itself. So Tosfos says, why are they doing Lishkas HaGazos and not in the Azara? The Azara had more Kedusha than Lishkas HaGazos. So Tosfos gives two reasons. His first reason was because they took off somebody's hat. Somebody was not wearing a hat, he says. And it's gnai, it's not appropriate to stand in the Azara proper without a hat. Then he brings another explanation that they would stand in a circle, and that means if you stand in a circle, somebody in the circle is going to be Acharem El Heichal Hashem, is back to the Heichal, that's not appropriate. In the Sefer Leket Yosher, by a student of the Trumas Hadeshen, he says, our Gemara indicates that a person shouldn't go bareheaded in a shul. Now, the Gemara is talking about the Azara, and this is a tricky question in general. There are certain halachas that apply to the Azara that don't apply to shuls. Other halachas that apply to the Azara do apply to shuls. That's a discussion elsewhere in Shas, which halachas of the Azara apply to shuls, which don't. But the Leket Yosher brings, b'shem someone else, he says, b'shem a certain gon, that if Tosfos says that they wouldn't do the payas in the Azara because one Kohen would be bareheaded, they would take off his hat, and therefore it wasn't appropriate for him to be in the Azara bareheaded, that's a source for the idea that you shouldn't stand in a shul bareheaded that's not covered for the shul. Similarly, he says, it's also the other teretz of Tosfos, you shouldn't stand with your back to the Heichal Hashem, you shouldn't stand with your back to the Aron Kodesh either, because the Aron Kodesh is like the Heichal. But the Leket Yosher is saying that the person shouldn't stand bareheaded in shul. This is actually brought in Shulchan Aruch. Various Rishonim make this point that it's not entirely clear whether wearing a kippah, a yarmulke, is a chiyuv to wear it all day, a minhag, a midas chasidus. But many Rishonim say that even if you're not going to cover your head throughout the day, but you should cover your head when you say Hashem's name, when you're motzi askara. And also some Rishonim say, the Shulchan Aruch brings, that you shouldn't enter a shul with bareheaded, you should cover your head in shul. And other Rishonim just say it, but Leket Yosher says our Gemara is the source. Since our Gemara says if the Kohen who takes off his mitznefes, it wouldn't be appropriate for him to be in the Azara bareheaded, we learn from that, not just the Azara, even a shul. A shul is a mikdash ma'at. Even a shul, it's not appropriate for a person to be in a shul bareheaded, without a hat.